I still remember the day my life turned upside down. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and I had just returned from running errands. The mailbox at the end of our driveway caught my eye as I pulled in. There it was, a thick envelope with a certified mail sticker glaring back at me. Something about it felt off, like a storm cloud forming on what had been a perfectly sunny day. My heart sank a little as I carried it inside, dreading whatever lay within. The moment I opened the envelope, my hands started to tremble. Inside was a letter, not just any letter, but one from the Maplewood Homeowners Association's lawyer. At first glance, it seemed official and intimidating. As I read through the neatly typed words, my stomach churned. They were suing me for $279,000. Yes, you heard that right. $250,000 because of my pickup truck. My old Ford F-150 wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't flashy or new. In fact, it was pretty banged up after years of hauling gardening supplies, furniture, and tools for home repairs. But it was reliable, practical, and most importantly, mine. Ever since we moved into this neighborhood 2 years ago, I'd parked it in my driveway whenever I needed it. Never once did I think twice about it. After all, it was my asterisk driveway. Who could possibly object? According to the HOA, they could. In their letter, they cited some obscure rule buried deep in their guidelines. Section 6.8. See if you want to get technical. This rule stated that only approved vehicles were allowed to be visible in driveways. And apparently, my trusty workhorse didn't make the cut. They claimed it ruined the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood, lowering property values and making things look messy. Messy. Can you believe that? All because of a vehicle that worked harder than half the people around here combined. At first, I thought it must be a prank. Maybe someone mistyped the amount or mixed up addresses. How could anyone justify taking legal action over something so trivial? Surely, cooler heads would prevail, and the whole thing would blow over. But when I called the HOA office later that evening, hoping to clear things up, their response left me speechless. Instead of apologizing or offering clarification, the person on the other end sounded almost robotic. "These rules are in place for everyone's benefit," she said flatly. "You've violated them repeatedly." Repeatedly. That stung. I hadn't done anything malicious or harmful. I simply lived my life, doing chores, taking care of my family, and occasionally using my truck to get things done. Now suddenly, I was being painted as some kind of troublemaker who deserved punishment. The weight of the situation pressed down on me as I hung up the phone. What was I supposed to do? Fight back? Give in? Or try to reason with people who clearly weren't interested in listening? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined worst-case scenarios. Losing our house, drowning in debt, watching everything Ryan and I had worked so hard for slip away. All because of a stupid truck. Yet beneath the fear was a flicker of anger. Why should I have to tiptoe around ridiculous rules that no reasonable person would enforce? Wasn't this America, where owning property meant having the freedom to use it how you saw fit? By morning, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this go unanswered. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't roll over without a fight. Let me take you back to the days before everything spiraled out of control. When Ryan and I first bought our home in Maplewood, it felt like a dream come true. The neighborhood was charming. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and friendly faces waving hello as we unpacked boxes on moving day. We were told the HOA was easygoing, just there to keep things tidy and make sure everyone followed basic guidelines. You know, nothing too extreme. Things like keeping your grass trimmed and avoiding loud music late at night. Nothing that would raise eyebrows or cause stress. Our real estate agent even joked about the HOA during the closing process. "Oh, they're harmless," she said with a laugh. "Just don't paint your house neon green, and you'll be fine." That comment stuck with me because it reinforced what I already believed. This was a community built on trust and mutual respect. Sure, there were rules, but they weren't meant to suffocate us. They were supposed to enhance the quality of life for everyone, or so I thought. The truth is, when we moved in, I didn't give the HOA much thought. Life was busy enough trying to settle into a new routine. Ryan worked long hours at his job, and I spent my days juggling errands, managing household chores, and making sure Sophie stayed entertained. My pickup truck became part of that rhythm. It was practical, dependable, and always ready whenever I needed it. Whether I was hauling bags of mulch for the garden or picking up furniture from a secondhand store, it made life easier. At first, no one seemed to care about the truck. In fact, some neighbors complimented me on how handy it must be. One guy across the street even asked if I could recommend a mechanic since he was looking to fix up an old van. I remember thinking, *C. People understand *. Nobody blinked twice when my truck sat in the driveway overnight after a weekend project. It blended into the background of daily life, just another piece of the puzzle. But then subtle signs began to creep in, things I didn't notice until later. Like the way certain neighbors stopped waving hello or avoided small talk when we passed each other on walks, or the passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes. "Wow, that's quite the vehicle," Mrs. Harper said one afternoon while I watered the plants near the driveway. Her tone was light, but her eyes lingered on the rust spots and dents. At the time, I brushed it off as harmless teasing. Looking back, though, I realized it was more than that. It was a warning. Then came Greg Thompson, the self-appointed guardian of Maplewood's perfection. He showed up at our door one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, and a plastered smile on his face. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he chirped, pretending to admire the flower beds. "Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" I nodded politely, unsure where this was going. "Well," he continued, clearing his throat, "I wanted to touch base about something. Your truck. It's been brought to our attention that it might not align with the aesthetic standards outlined in our guidelines." Aesthetic standards? Seriously. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Was he really standing there critiquing my mode of transportation? "It's not personal," he added quickly, sensing my disbelief. "We just want to maintain consistency throughout the community. Perhaps you could consider parking it elsewhere. Maybe in the garage or offsite." His words hit me like a slap in the face. Not only was he questioning my choices, but he was also implying that my truck somehow tarnished the neighborhood. Consistency. Aesthetics. These buzzwords masked what he really meant: conformity. They wanted everyone to look the same, act the same, and live the same cookie-cutter existence. And if you stepped out of line, even in the smallest way, you'd hear about it. I forced a tight smile and nodded, promising to look into it. But inside, I seethed. Who were these people to dictate how I lived my life? My truck wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't causing noise complaints or blocking sidewalks. It was simply doing its job, quietly and efficiently. Yet here was Greg, acting like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. That encounter should have been my wake-up call. Instead, I let it slide, convincing myself it was a one-time thing. Surely, they'd move on to bigger issues, or so I hoped. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a battle I never saw coming. After Greg's visit, life in Maplewood started to feel different. Subtle changes crept into our daily routine, like shadows stretching longer as the sun sets. At first, it was small things, notes tucked under our doormat, handwritten on plain paper with no signature. "Please remember the guidelines about vehicles," one read. Another said, "Your truck is noticeable." Noticeable? What did that even mean? Was I supposed to shrink it down or make it invisible? The notes bothered me more than I cared to admit. They weren't just reminders. They felt like threats designed to unsettle me. Whoever wrote them wanted me to know I was being watched, and it worked. Every time I parked my truck in the driveway, I'd glance around nervously, half expecting someone to pop out and scold me. It was exhausting, like living under a microscope where every move I made was scrutinized. Neighbors who once greeted us warmly now seemed distant, Mrs. Harper stopped inviting me over for coffee. The couple next door avoided eye contact when we passed them on walks. Even Sophie noticed. One evening, she asked why her friend Emma hadn't come over to play in weeks. I didn't have an answer for her. At least not one I could put into words without sounding paranoid. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Our family was being quietly ostracized, punished for refusing to conform. And then came the fines. Thin envelopes arrived in the mail, each containing a formal notice of violation. The first one demanded $50 for improper vehicle display. $50 for leaving my truck in my own driveway overnight. I crumpled the letter in frustration and threw it in the trash. Ryan tried to calm me down. "Just pay it," he said. "It's easier than fighting." But paying felt wrong. It felt like admitting guilt for something I hadn't done. So I ignored the fine, hoping they'd leave me alone if I didn't engage. Of course, they didn't. A second envelope arrived, this time demanding $100. Then a third, doubling the amount again. Each notice added another layer of stress, another reminder that they weren't going to back off. Ryan grew increasingly worried. "They're not playing around," he said one night, flipping through the stack of letters on the kitchen counter. "What happens if they take this further? Sue us? Put a lion on the house?" His questions hung heavy in the air between us. I didn't have answers, only fears that kept me awake at night. How could anyone justify fining someone thousands of dollars over a truck? It wasn't logical. It was absurd. Yet here we were, caught in their web of rules and consequences. Then, one evening, the bombshell dropped. Another certified letter arrived, thicker than the rest. My heart raced as I opened it, already dreading what I might find inside. This time, it wasn't just a fine. It was a lawsuit, a full-blown legal battle demanding $279,000 in damages. According to the HOA, my refusal to remove my truck had caused irreparable harm to the neighborhood's reputation. They claimed it lowered property values and disrupted the community's harmony. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document, unable to believe what I was reading. $279,000. Over a truck. A beat-up old Ford F-150 that barely ran half the time. The audacity of it left me speechless. Who were these people to decide what constituted harm? To slap a price tag on something so trivial? As the reality sank in, anger bubbled up inside me. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. It was about power. They wanted to control me, to force me into submission by hitting me where it hurt. My wallet. If I gave in now, what would stop them from coming after me, or anyone else, for something else tomorrow? Where would it end? That night, I lay awake, replaying the events in my mind. Each note, each fine, each cold stare from a neighbor, it all led to this moment. The HOA wasn't just targeting me. They were sending a message to everyone in Maplewood. Follow the rules, or face the consequences. But I couldn't let them win. Not like this. Something inside me snapped. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the right to live freely, without fear of punishment for being different. And so, as dawn broke the next morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't back down. Whatever it took, I would stand my ground, even if it meant taking on the entire neighborhood. The lawsuit hit us like a tidal wave, sweeping away whatever sense of security we had left. Ryan and I sat at the kitchen table for hours that night, staring at the legal documents spread out in front of us. The numbers, $279,000, loomed large, almost mocking us. How could anyone justify demanding so much money over something as trivial as a truck? It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about this situation made sense. I felt paralyzed at first, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. Legal battles aren't cheap, and hiring a lawyer seemed impossible when every penny we had was already tied up in bills and mortgage payments. Friends offered sympathy but little practical advice. "That's insane," one said when I told her about the lawsuit. "What are they even thinking?" Another suggested I just give in and park the truck somewhere else. "It's not worth all this stress," she said gently. But giving in wasn't an option, not anymore. Every time I thought about backing down, I pictured Greg Thompson smirking behind his clipboard, knowing he'd won. I imagined my neighbors whispering to each other, congratulating themselves on putting me in my place. And worst of all, I thought about Sophie watching silently from the sidelines, learning how easily people can be silenced if they don't fight back. Determined to push forward, I started researching lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. Most were expensive or uninterested in taking on such a high-profile case. Then I found Claire Martinez. Her name popped up in online forums where homeowners shared horror stories about their own battles with overbearing associations. One comment stood out: "If you want someone who will stand up to bullies, call Claire." When I finally reached her office, a small, no-frills space tucked above a coffee shop downtown, I immediately liked her. She was sharp, straightforward, and refreshingly unimpressed by intimidation tactics. After hearing my story, she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "Wow," she said. "They really went for it, didn't they?" Claire explained that cases like mine weren't uncommon. HOAs often used lawsuits as scare tactics, banking on people being too afraid or financially strapped to fight back. But she also believed we had a strong case. "Their argument is weak," she said confidently. "You're not causing any real harm here. This is about control, plain and simple. If we expose that, we can win." With Claire on board, I dove headfirst into uncovering everything I could about the HOA. What I discovered shocked me. Through public records and old news articles, I learned that Maplewoods Association had a history of targeting residents who didn't toe the line. There were stories of families forced into foreclosure because of mounting fines, couples driven out of town after refusing to comply with arbitrary rules, and even whispers of selective enforcement, where some neighbors got away with violations while others were singled out. One case stuck with me. A retired couple named the Millers had been fined repeatedly for having a bird bath in their front yard. When they couldn't pay, the HOA placed a lion on their home. Eventually, they sold the property and moved away, heartbroken. Reading their story made me furious, and more determined than ever to see this through. Armed with evidence and a renewed sense of purpose, I began reaching out to other neighbors. At first, many were hesitant to talk. They didn't want to rock the boat or risk becoming the next target. But slowly, a few brave souls stepped forward. One woman confessed she'd been fined for painting her mailbox a shade of blue slightly darker than the approved color palette. Another admitted he'd been warned about letting his kids leave toys outside. Their stories painted a picture of a community living in quiet fear, tiptoeing around rules designed to strip them of individuality. As word spread about my fight against the HOA, something remarkable happened. People started rallying around me, not vocally, since most still feared retaliation, but in small, meaningful ways. Anonymous notes of encouragement appeared under our door. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to us in months suddenly smiled warmly when we passed them on the street. Even Sophie noticed a shift. "Emma came over today," she announced one afternoon, beaming. She said her mom told her we're doing something brave. Brave. That word stuck with me. Fighting the HOA wasn't easy. In fact, it was terrifying. But knowing I wasn't alone gave me strength. With Claire's guidance, the support of newfound allies, and a fire burning inside me, I prepared to face whatever came next. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't back down without a fight. The day of the courtroom showdown arrived, and I felt like I was stepping onto a stage for a performance I hadn't rehearsed. The air inside the courthouse was heavy with tension, almost suffocating. Rows of wooden benches lined the walls, and the sharp scent of polished floors filled the room. My stomach churned as I took my seat beside Claire, clutching a folder stuffed with documents that suddenly felt flimsy in the face of what we were up against. Across the aisle sat Greg Thompson and his team of lawyers, men and women in crisp suits who looked like they'd just stepped out of a legal drama. They'd radiated confidence, exchanging smug smiles and quiet whispers. It was clear they expected this to be an easy win. After all, how could a regular person like me possibly stand a chance against their army of attorneys and decades of HOA precedent? As the gallery filled with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers, I couldn't help but notice the divide in the room. On one side were those loyal to the HOA, nodding along whenever Greg spoke. On the other were people who had quietly supported us, their expressions tense but hopeful. Sophie sat near the back with Ryan, her small hand gripping his tightly. Seeing them gave me a flicker of strength, a reminder of why I was doing this. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He was older, with silver hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His voice carried authority as he called the court to order. Claire stood first, her presence commanding. She didn't waste time tiptoeing around the issue. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about property values or aesthetics. It's about control. The plaintiff is using these guidelines as a weapon to punish anyone who dares challenge their authority." She went on to dismantle the HOA's argument piece by piece. With laser-like precision, she pointed out inconsistencies in their enforcement policies. For example, several residents own trucks, but because they parked them in garages or driveways hidden from view, they were never fined. Why was my truck singled out when it served the exact same purpose? Claire argued that the HOA's interpretation of aesthetic harm was subjective at best and discriminatory at worst. Then came the kicker. She presented evidence showing that similar lawsuits filed by other HOAs had been thrown out due to lack of merit. "This isn't about protecting the neighborhood," she said firmly. "It's about punishing someone who refused to conform. And that's not justice, it's bullying." When Greg took the stand, his calm demeanor cracked under Claire's cross-examination. She pushed him to explain why certain vehicles were considered acceptable while others weren't. "Is it the color?" she asked. "The make, the model? Or is it simply because Mrs. Carter chose to park hers where you could see it?" Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his answers growing more defensive. "We have standards for a reason," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "People buy homes here expecting consistency. Allowing exceptions undermines the entire system." Claire raised an eyebrow. "So, if Mrs. Carter had parked her truck in her garage instead of her driveway, there would be no issue?" He hesitated before answering. "Correct." The absurdity of his response wasn't lost on anyone. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, and even the judge seemed unimpressed. Claire pressed further, asking Greg to quantify the alleged $279,000 in damages. How exactly had my truck caused such astronomical harm? He stumbled over his words, unable to provide concrete evidence beyond vague claims about negative impact. By the time Greg stepped down, sweat glistened on his forehead. The confident facade he'd worn earlier was crumbling, replaced by frustration and discomfort. Watching him squirm gave me a strange sense of satisfaction, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because it proved what I'd known all along. Their case was built on shaky ground. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge announced he would take some time to review the evidence before delivering his verdict. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt drained but hopeful. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe we might actually win. But deep down, I knew this fight wasn't truly over. Not yet. Whether we won or lost, the scars it left behind would linger. For me, for my family, and for the entire community. The wait for the judge's decision was agonizing. Days stretched into weeks, each one feeling longer than the last. Every time the phone rang or an envelope appeared in the mailbox, my heart raced, convinced it was finally over. But life went on in limbo, neither victorious nor defeated, just stuck in a tense holding pattern. When the verdict finally came, it hit like a thunderclap. The judge ruled decisively in our favor, dismissing the lawsuit entirely. He called the HOA's claims frivolous and punitive, stating that their interpretation of the guidelines wasn't just unreasonable, it was outright oppressive. Even better, He ordered the HOA to cover our legal fees. It wasn't everything we'd hoped for. They weren't forced to pay damages, but it felt like justice all the same. News of the ruling spread quickly. Reporters camped outside our house, eager to hear my side of the story. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before now approached me with words of gratitude. Some admitted they'd always thought the rules were unfair, but didn't know how to challenge them. Others confessed they'd quietly cheered me on from the sidelines, hoping I'd succeed where others had failed. But the aftermath wasn't all sunshine and celebration. Greg resigned as HOA president almost immediately, leaving behind a power vacuum that sparked infighting among board members. Long simmering tensions boiled over as residents debated whether to reform the association or disband it altogether. Factions formed, splitting neighbors into two camps: those who wanted stricter enforcement of the rules and those pushing for change. For a while, it seemed like Maplewood might tear itself apart. Meetings turned into shouting matches, with tempers flaring over every minor issue. Claire warned me that winning the lawsuit wouldn't magically fix everything overnight. Change takes time, she said during one of our follow-up calls. You've cracked open the door, but someone has to walk through it. That someone ended up being me, or rather, a group of us. Inspired by the victory, several neighbors banded together to push for reforms within the HOA. We drafted petitions calling for clearer, fairer guidelines and more transparency in decision-making. Slowly, we gained traction. People who had once kept their heads down started speaking out, sharing stories of fines, threats, and intimidation. What began as a trickle soon became a flood. Still, not everyone was happy about the shift. A vocal minority clung to the old ways, accusing us of ruining the neighborhood's character. Mrs. Harper led this group, her icy demeanor returning with a vengeance. At one particularly heated meeting, she stood up and declared, "If you don't care about standards, maybe you don't belong here." Her words stung, but they also galvanized us. For every person trying to hold on to control, there were two more ready to break free of it. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that this fight had changed me. And not just in obvious ways. Before the lawsuit, I was content to blend in, to keep my head down and avoid rocking the boat. Now, I realized how much I valued standing up for what I believed in, even if it meant facing criticism or conflict. Watching Sophie grow braver and more outspoken gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we were setting an example worth following. By the time the dust settled, the HOA looked nothing like it had before. New leadership took charge, promising to prioritize fairness over fear. Guidelines were rewritten, eliminating many of the nitpicky rules that had caused so much grief. While some scars remained, broken friendships, lingering mistrust, I could see glimpses of something brighter taking shape. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I noticed something remarkable. More trucks were appearing in driveways up and down the street. Not flashy ones, but workhorses like mine. Vehicles that told a story of hard work, practicality, and individuality. Each one was a quiet rebellion, a testament to the fact that sometimes progress starts with parking your truck exactly where it belongs. Months after the lawsuit ended, life in Maplewood began to settle into a new rhythm. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. It never would be. But there was a sense of relief in the air, like we'd all taken a deep breath after holding it for too long. People seemed lighter somehow, less afraid to express themselves or make choices that reflected who they really were. Even my old Ford F-150, still proudly parked in the driveway, drew fewer sideways glances these days. The HOA reforms didn't happen overnight. It took months of meetings, debates, and compromises to rewrite the guidelines in a way that felt fair to everyone, or at least most people. Some neighbors dug their heels in, insisting on keeping certain rules intact, while others pushed for sweeping changes. But slowly, progress emerged. Rules about approved vehicles disappeared entirely, replaced by broader language about safety and functionality. Lawn maintenance standards became suggestions rather than mandates, and perhaps most importantly, residents gained a voice in how decisions were made, with open forums replacing closed-door sessions. For me, the biggest change wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the atmosphere of the community. Before the lawsuit, fear had hung over us like a shadow, dictating our actions and silencing dissent. Now, though, there was room for conversation, and even disagreement, without the threat of punishment looming overhead. Neighbors started talking again, sharing stories and ideas instead of avoiding each other. Someone organized a block party, something I hadn't seen since we moved in. Watching kids race around the cul-de-sac while parents laughed over lemonade reminded me why communities exist in the first place. Connection, not control. Still, scars remained. Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when it's been broken so thoroughly. Mrs. Harper and her group continued to grumble about the decline of Maplewood, though their voices grew quieter as more people embraced the new normal. A few families moved away, unable to reconcile themselves with the shifting dynamics. Others arrived, drawn by the promise of a neighborhood that valued individuality alongside unity. Sophie noticed the changes too. One afternoon, she came home from school bubbling with excitement. "Guess what?" she said, dropping her backpack on the floor. "Emma says her mom is letting her paint a mural on their fence." I smiled, imagining the colorful design Emma might create. "That sounds fun," I said. "What do you think she'll paint?" "Flowers and butterflies," Sophie replied. "She says it's okay because the HOA can't stop her anymore." Her words stayed with me long after she ran off to play. They captured something essential about what we'd fought for. Not just freedom from arbitrary rules, but the chance to live authentically, without apology. That little girl painting flowers on her fence represented everything I hoped Maplewood could become, a place where creativity flourished, differences were celebrated, and no one lived in fear of being singled out. Of course, challenges lingered. Old habits die hard, and some neighbors still struggle to let go of the need for perfection. Occasionally, disputes arose over noise levels or holiday decorations, but they were resolved through dialogue rather than fines or threats. Each small victory reinforced the idea that conflict doesn't have to divide us. It can bring us closer together if handled with respect and understanding. As I reflect on everything that happened, I realize this fight taught me more than I ever expected. It showed me the power of standing firm in the face of injustice, even when the odds seem insurmountable. It reminded me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And it proved that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, like parking your truck in your driveway, can spark meaningful change. Now, when I sit on the porch watching the world go by, I feel a quiet pride. My truck may be dented and worn, but it stands as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that life isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about carving out your own space and holding onto it fiercely, even when others try to take it away. Maplewood isn't perfect, but maybe that's the point. Perfection is boring. Real life, the messy, unpredictable kind, is far more beautiful.